Now to the 75th anniversary of a Bay Area disaster that changed the nation. In 1944, African-American sailors were loading munitions onto a ship at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine on Suisun Bay. The sailors had no safety training and were told the munitions were not live, but it turned out they were. A massive explosion ripped through the pier, killing 320 servicemen. Several weeks later, 50 black sailors refused to load munitions in Vallejo out of concern for their safety. All were found guilty of mutiny. But the episode galvanized a movement to desegregate the Navy and eventually the entire military. Now a new exhibit at the Treasure Island Museum sheds light on the Port Chicago explosion and its impact on the fight for racial justice. Joining me now to discuss all of this are the president of the Treasure Island Museum, Walt Bilofsky, and Mary Wardell-Ghirarduzzi, Chief Diversity Officer at the University of San Francisco. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Mary, you're also the president of the San Francisco Public Library Commission, and you've been working with the Treasure Island Museum on this exhibit. Take us back to that day in July 1944 when the explosion happened. What was the scene like?
Well, the scene was a terrible tragedy in so many ways. You had these very young men that were working in an environment that they were not prepared for, and they suffered the worst type of tragedy that you can ever imagine. And so the survivors of the Port Chicago essentially had said, we are not going to go back. At least 50 of them, that was. And these were ordinary young men. They were between 18, maybe 21, 22 years old.
So young.
They were already in a segregated situation. Over 200 of the individuals that were lost were African-American sailors and other individuals. And so these 50 young black sailors who had everything to lose if they went back. They were afraid for their own safety. They saw their mates with dismembered bodies, were ordered to go back immediately, while the white officers were given the proper grievance time off. And somehow or another, they were able to muster the courage and the solidarity to say, we will rather go and face court-martial with the United States Navy, which also meant that they, at that time, they could have been sentenced to death.
So, Walt, take us back to that era. Why were tasks like this, loading live munitions onto a ship, why were those types of tasks assigned primarily to black sailors?
Well, the Navy was segregated, and frankly, it was racist. These sailors had joined the Navy to go fight the enemy, and they were put to work doing manual labor loading these munitions. They were supervised by white officers who were under a lot of time pressure. They pushed the crews to work faster and faster, and then they bet with each other on which crew could load the most ammunition and punished the men if they lost the bet. It was a terrible situation.
And so, Mary, how did this protest by the 50 men eventually influence the Navy and eventually the entire military to desegregate?
Well, this is the story. This is a civil rights story that begins in San Francisco Bay Area that I don't think that people know about. We often think about Atlanta and other parts of the United States where the civil rights was born, but this 50 young men were really the ones that set the early precedents to the modern civil rights movement that we knew. And so essentially the Navy moved forward through this trial and after the trial to be the first branch of the military to begin desegregation. And under President Truman, he ordered thereby all the U.S. armed forces followed. And so essentially these 50 black sailors, ordinary young men facing all loss, gave an extraordinary contribution to racial justice and social justice in the United States, and it happened here.
But did the military desegregate for altruistic reasons in the beginning, or were they, frankly, a little scared of seeing these 50 young black men band together?
Well, the thing is that I'm sure that there was publicity that was going on at the time, and this was a precursor to this modern civil rights movement. But at the same time, the tragedy was so significant. I mean, that's one thing that we cannot deny. It was so horrific. There had never been that type of incident happen on the U.S. soil that I think that even then they knew that there was something that was not right about it.
Yeah, there were two things going on, really. One was the publicity. You know, the NAACP was involved. Thurgood Marshall was a young attorney,
Yes.
the counsel for the NAACP. He came out to assist with the trial. And so there was a lot of publicity and a lot of attention afterwards.
Yeah.
But also, the Navy realized that if they segregated black sailors into black units, they were creating black unity. And they realized that was going to be a problem if they kept doing that.
So they thought by
Yeah.
splitting them up and desegregating, that would actually weaken their resolve on a lot of
Yeah.
things. And what happened to the sailors who were convicted of mutiny afterwards? How did that affect their lives later on?
Well, they received about 7-year prison sentences, most of them. After the war, those were reduced to about 2 years, and they were returned to service and discharged.
Were they able to find work? Were they able to live normal lives after that?
Not really. I believe they received general discharges, and it was a black mark on their records that
Yeah.
followed them for most of their lives. Which is one of the reasons why the Port Chicago story took so long to become well known, because this was something they were ashamed of. Sometimes their families didn't know about it. They didn't want to talk about it. And eventually the families learned. Professor Robert Allen at Berkeley found out about it and wrote a book in the 1990s, and that really helped make it more widely known.
And Mary, of all the men convicted, only one received a pardon from President Bill Clinton.
Yes.
And some of the men said a pardon implied they were guilty. Instead, they
Absolutely.
wanted exoneration. They wanted their names cleared. Is there any effort underway to try to get exoneration for them?
You know what? I believe that there is some exoneration efforts that are going on right now. And the things that under the President Obama, there was not a successful exonerations that happened. And so
Why is that? Do you know why did that happen?
Do you know the specifics?
I don't really know about that. I know maybe the president was reluctant to push race issues on too many fronts, but there is an organization, the Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial, which is working to clear the names of the sailors and working for the families, and exoneration is one of their priorities.
Mary, what's the connection between those 50 men convicted 75 years ago to what you're seeing today?
Well, you know, one of the things is that justice does not happen in a vacuum. The arc of moral justice is really long, and it always bends towards righteousness. And these 50 men were essentially banded together in this act of solidarity. And it's connected directly to what we saw with Rosa Parks, connected directly to what we see today in Black Lives Matter, and even more recently, what we're seeing with Colin Kaepernick. You know, this whole idea of how do you stand up at a time when the society doesn't believe that necessarily what you believe is right. These 50 young men are directly connected to the young people that are here in the Bay Area, that are in Florida, that are all throughout the United States, that are saying this particular issue is not right.
It's certainly a story that still resonates today. Mary Wardell-Ghirarduzzi and Walt Bilofsky, thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
And to learn more about Port Chicago and its impact on the civil rights movement, you can attend a lecture moderated by Mary tomorrow at Treasure Island. Visit treasureislandmuseum.org/Port Chicago to make a free reservation for the talk. Space is limited.